So I was asked, I had just a couple questions that I was asked to address, but before I get to those, I really want to take us back. And I mentioned this earlier when Brent asked the question about his wife. I mean, this is a decades-long challenge we've gotten ourselves into, and I speak more as the full food industry rather than any one entity within it. So I want to take us back on a little history journey to get us grounded in maybe why we're having some of the challenges with connecting and communicating with consumers in the first place. I'll talk through what we've learned through some of our years of research, and most specifically some of the messaging that we've come away with in this last year. Some of the sources that people really trust, some of the places they go for trusted information, to help you kind of think about, it's not just about having the right message, it's about having the right messenger, it's about being in the right spaces, and then having a different approach to the way we come into these conversations. So before I do that, we're at that point in the afternoon. I always seem to be ending up in this spot where everybody needs to stretch or move a little bit. So I'm going to actually ask you to just, if you want to jump up and say, "That's me," when I say something that resonates with you, you can do that. That's what I normally make my audiences do. But you can just raise your hand and say, "That's me," if this sounds like you. So how many of you, if what I say is true for you, say, "That's me"? How many of you have more than 10 years of experience within this industry? That's me. Okay, a little louder. How many of you have been with your current company, agency, university, etc. for a decade?
That's me.
Okay. How many of you have an allergy? That's me. Food, environment, otherwise. Okay. How many of you are parents? That's me. Okay. How many of you eat? That's me. Okay. Remember that. Remember some of these things. It's important to know who you are and how you feel, what your values are. We'll get to that, especially later. Always try to find how you can relate to people as you're in these conversations. Just a little bit about CFI. We're a young organization. We're about 8 years old, and we were formed based on this mission, to build consumer trust and confidence in today's food system. It's a big and bold mission because, as we've learned, trust isn't where we would want it to be. So it's a mission that we strive for every day, and everything that we do supports that mission. To support it, we do several things. One, on a year-over-year basis, we research consumer opinion. We want to understand what their perceptions are on different issues across the industry, and we want to understand how we can be impactful for what they're thinking, believing, feeling. We then take those research results and we put them into play and help the industry understand what do people want, need, what are they confused about, et cetera. And then we develop programming around them. So we have a communications training program. We do different platforms to help people within the industry come together, and we facilitate dialogue so we can all do better. And then finally, we do consumer outreach and different constituent outreach to make sure that what we've learned is actually put into practice. Our membership base and project supporters are pretty broad and diverse. I mean, we really work as, we think as an umbrella corporation over for the industry, really representing all of these different types of groups throughout, some of whom are in the room today. Like I said, we'll go over our 2014 consumer research. If anybody's interested in this, there is a summary document on the foodintegrity.org website, so if you're interested, you can follow up on that afterwards or ask questions on that. I'm happy to send a link. As we think about what's going on in the food industry, we ask the right direction, wrong track question on a year-over-year basis, just to get a sense of where we are. This is similar to Gallup polling for what they do politically. And in 2014, 42% of our respondents, and we have about 2,000 who would participate every year, said that 42% said that the food industry is moving in the right direction. 30% said we're going down the wrong track, and 27% said that they were unsure. It's significant, a statistically significant shift from the year prior, about 8 points, that people that move from the wrong direction wrong track to right direction, which we think is great, but we don't have that follow-up to be able to understand why or what made that shift. So we'll continue to follow that. In the previous year, we saw actually a shift towards wrong direction. So we'll continue to monitor that. Brent, this is another one that addresses your question about the way that you make decisions. As we ask women and men, or as we look at those differences, you can see that comparing men's perception to the total population's perception, women have a higher level of skepticism across every single issue we ask about, including what is the general direction of the industry, how are you feeling about it? So women had a slightly higher perception of wrong track. Men had a much higher direction, or higher perception in terms of right direction. We also pay attention to the perceptions of early adopters. These are the people that are food opinion leaders. They research, they favor science, they're more economically sound, they're higher educated. These are people that not only seek information on the topic, but then they also seek to spread that information once they've formed their opinion. They have a higher level of skepticism than the general population as well for what's going on in the food industry. Women and early adopters are people that we want on our side, right? We want them believing that what's going on in the food industry is actually positive for them. And so we're really looking to address that gap that exists. In 2014, the data on the bottom, we really strove to understand more from some specific subsets of the population, that being moms, millennials, and foodies. I think as we think about people that are helping shape what the next generation of the food system is going to look like, as well as those people who are influencers over others and those that are really making decisions for households, all of these types of people fit into that. And what I'll show you here is with the moms, we basically fell out a third, right direction, wrong track, or unsure. So there's a lot of opportunity there. With the millennials, you had a slightly higher than the moms, but lower than the general population for right direction. And one thing that was very shocking to us, we weren't expecting this, but as you look at the foodies, almost 50% of the foodie population feels that the food system is moving in the right direction. What we can understand from that is simply they know what they want out of the food industry. They have their preferences, and the food industry, the way it's set up, really allows that choice for them to get access to what it is they want. So they've made up their decision, made up their mind about what's important to them, and the food industry allows them that choice. What we know then is trust isn't exactly where we want it to be, right? We still have improvement. We don't even have half the population, aside from men, saying that we really like what's going on within the food industry. So when we look at this trust situation, we wanted to know more about how we got here. And where we landed was the year 1968. And this was a pivotal year for a lot of things going on within the social environment and how people really started to view institutions. If you go back then, this was about 5 years into Vietnam, here stateside. And we had some significant things that happened within that year that helped people start to trust in mistrust and understand this idea that big might not necessarily be good anymore. So what was going on? The war was raging. This was the first time that war was actually broadcast into our homes. So new media allowed us to get access in a way that was different than before. And as we think about the environment right now with the digital age, social media, all of our online channels to be continuously connected, we're seeing more and more challenges as it relates to that. But media in that time allowed us to look at what was going on with military and government interaction, especially. We had assassination of Bobby Kennedy Jr., presidential candidate, and Martin Luther King Jr. We also had the Democratic National Convention where protesters were taken over. This was also the year that we saw the planet Earth from outer space on Christmas Eve. So this also sparked the Green Revolution, where people said, finite resources, we have to do something to preserve. Into the 70s, or excuse me, coming into the 70s then, this was the first resignation of a US president as well with the Watergate scandal. Again, questioning people's ability to trust somebody that they had put in a position of power. As you come into the late 70s, into the 80s, we see more institutions that people thought they could trust start to do some questionable things, have some missteps. So within the religious community, you had Jimmy Swaggart and Jim Baker. With Iran, Iran-Contra, we're arming the enemy. 3 Mile Island, another big environmental disaster, and Exxon Valdez. Into the 90s and early 2000s, you had more scandal with Clinton and Monica Lewinsky. The financial crisis that started to unfold with Enron and Arthur Andersen in those early 2000s, followed up by more and more. You see the sports industry pulled in. The religious community comes in. More environmental disaster. The education industry or institutions that we saw with Penn State and the abuse that took there. So more and more and more drama, all of these attached to big institutions over time. And what we have kind of pulled from these are some significant shifts that have happened within the social world that we live in. It used to be that authority was primarily granted by office. So if you elected somebody and put them in a position of power, your clergy person, a president of a company, the leader of the nation, anybody that was in a position to make decisions on behalf of people, that's who we put in our trust box. Now, authority is primarily granted by relationship, thinking about social media and how much people rely on the input of their friends and family, long-lost friends or non-friends from high school, right? It's all about who you know. There's some truth to that statement. It used to be that broad social consensus was driven by white Anglo-Saxon Protestant males. And as we look today, especially on social issues, there's not a great social consensus. There's a huge amount of diversity, and the voices that are in those conversations are at a global level. Communication used to be very formal and indirect, where you had 3 television stations, same story was told, they interviewed somebody different. So we moved from mass communication to masses of communicators, where everybody with a smartphone can be broadcasting to the world in a matter of seconds. Progress used to be inevitable, and in a room like this, if science tells us we can do something in the name of progress or efficiency, we should, right? But now we're in an environment where progress is possible, but society isn't really sure whether it wants to allow progress to happen. We have to have an analysis of all the risk and benefit for anything to really proceed meaningfully. As we think about all of those changes that have happened, and we think about what's gone into the food industry as it is today, there's been a huge amount of consolidation and integration and industrialization that's taken place over that same amount of time, going back to 1968. And when consumers look at what's going on in the food industry and the decisions that are made about the ingredients that go into food, they really are in a position where they're questioning, is what I saw on Food Inc. the reality of what's going on in today's food industry? Add to it many different things. One, the public understands there have been changes that have taken place and are being made on my behalf, but they don't perceive a value that they're getting from those changes. They're not understanding why. You all said you eat. So food is necessary. It's something we all have to participate in. But not only that, it's tied to traditions. It's very emotional, right? We always involve food in our celebrations and our mourning. Media focuses on dramatic news. So the statement that we use is consumers don't know what they don't know until somebody informs them of what they should be thinking about. And oftentimes that comes to fruition through media. Obviously, social media takes that and amplifies those issues very quickly. And online influencers, I mentioned food bloggers earlier, online influencers who have an active audience have a real way to influence the opinions of others and the actions that are taken. As we moved into this research, we also wanted to come into this challenge, and we wanted to embrace the challenge and come out of the research understanding, could we get people to consider science differently in their decision-making process? So we wanted to introduce some pretty controversial and complex, technical issues, but we knew we had to understand what goes into these different issues that helps inform people about how they should handle them. And we know that breaking down those communication barriers is going to be critical to helping them embrace all of the technologies that exist, all of the science that goes into our food today. And some of those barriers are ones that we've pulled from anthropology and sociology and psychology. One is cultural cognition, and this is a tendency for people to conform their beliefs about anything that's controversial into the group values that are going to define the norms for that culture. I have the picture here of the sports fans. You can imagine yourself at a big game and you're talking to your neighbor, and all of a sudden something happens in the game and everybody goes wild and you just jump up. It's kind of that reaction, whatever's happening around me, the groupthink, that people tend to do what the tribe around them or the culture around them dictates they do. Confirmation bias, certainly in DC this is probably a dangerous one to put up here. I should have chosen a different image there, but a tendency for people to favor information that already supports their existing belief. A great example of this is Google. You can have people within the toxicology industry saying, let's assess the risk benefits of a particular chemical ingredient, and you put that in with a consumer lens on it, and they say, is azodicarbonamide going to kill me? It's all about confirming what you might already believe or what you heard, and the way that you approach those conversations. We're also dealing with a barrier that communication has really changed over, even in the last 5 to 10 years, communication has changed. And we used to come from what we called a traditional communications channel, where you had basically one expert, consider any one of yourselves in an expert position, communicating out to multiple channels and being credible in that position. And now it's much more complex. You still have that ability, but people's ability to self-select the sources they go to is much more meaningful for them as individuals and much more accessible based on the tribal communications model that we have today. I wanted to share with you some of what we've learned in our research. This would be qualitative stuff. We actually got together a group of moms who said that they were highly skeptical. And I presented, we've done a lot of work on antibiotics and GMOs. Those were the 2 topics we focused on for our 2014 research, specifically because they're highly technical issues, and they drive some pretty reactionary responses when we present them to people. So I don't have anything that's specific to one chemical, but I thought GMOs was more appropriate in this setting to share with you kind of how people are coming forward on this issue. So we asked this group of moms who said they were highly skeptical about this topic, how had they come to their conclusions that GMOs are dangerous? And Heidi said, I'm part of a mom's group. When there's a big consensus, I think there's something here. You don't need doctors or scientists confirming it when you have hundreds of moms. Usually I get a moan or a grunt or something. Yeah. So the challenge here is, Heidi has found her tribe. She's found the people with which she connects, and she believes. And when there's this bias that what I know is true, I'm going to go to other people and reinforce that opinion, it's really hard to get her moved off of that. So understanding that exists. There's also a challenge today with tribal shunning, and when we asked about how you make food choices, we wanted to follow that up. You're highly skeptical, so how do you come to a place where you can actually go in and with any amount of confidence choose the food that ends up in your cupboards? And Lisa said, I think mom guilt is a huge factor. If somebody's telling you something is dangerous, for example, fructose, and you hear the message more than once, then you owe it to yourself to research it or quit consuming it. I can't keep giving my kids fructose if there's a potential problem. We have to do our best job. And you can see here, she's struggling. We have to do our best job. She's grasping at straws. She's, you think about her as a busy mom. She's either having to try to put it on herself to find the time to find a research piece that she trusts, or just quit. And that's what I talked about earlier. People opt out of something they fear quite readily, but they don't necessarily understand what they're opting into by opting out of that fear-based piece. I wanted to share, I'm sure many of you are familiar with Miss Hari here. This was just on her blog yesterday. If you've ever eaten pizza before, this will blow your mind, maybe literally. Toxic hidden MSG ingredients buried in popular pizza menu items. She also is the one, I won't have this exactly, but said, you should never ever eat a chemical ever. And we can send that, you can distribute that and see it for yourself. But the bad news bias is real, and there are influencers that really focus on that. There's research out of the Ohio State University that said one negative piece of information is capable of neutralizing 5 positive pieces of information. So as you think about the amount of information that's out there on chemicals, on ingredients you can't pronounce, on all of these things that consumers see as a threat or a challenge, we have to understand that being quiet on these issues or hoping they'll go away just really isn't an option. And then we have this factor that we all are making decisions on a daily basis, and we process information based on bounded rationality. So it's 3 things. It's our access to information, our cognitive ability to understand the information that's in front of us, and then the time it takes to process that through our decision making. When you think about that comment for Lisa, when she's like, we have to do our best job. If we can't find the right information, we've got to avoid it. I mean, this bounded rationality is a real challenge for her. This oftentimes, because we like to generalize and stereotype, will lead to confusing correlation with causation and drawing, gross misconclusions. But we know that not being an expert doesn't preclude one from having a strong opinion, right? I do have a clip. Is there audio on the computer? Hooked up? There is, okay. I thought this would funny. By this time in the day, you needed a little giggle. And I wanted to, again, focusing more on GMOs, we'll take it off of chemicals for a second, but this is one you hopefully will be able to laugh about. Let me see. And it's not gonna play. Okay. In any case, I pulled my favorite quote from the whole thing. We can center on the link too. This was, they went to the streets, and Jimmy Kimmel went to the streets and basically said, in a farmer's market, what is a GMO? What does it stand for? Most people didn't know. Most people had a lot of opinions about it, but no rationale as to why they felt that way. One of my favorites is this gal who said, I don't know, it's some corn bad stuff. I know it's bad, but to be completely honest with you, I have no idea. So I know it's some corn bad stuff. I know it's bad. I have no idea. But she had some pretty strong opinions about why she was avoiding it. So check that out. Google it just for humor's sake. So we know that this is the situation consumers are in. They don't know a fraction of what you all know, and they're faced with all of these different barriers to try to get to a point where they're informed in their decision making when they're trying to pick out a jar of pickles, right? So the challenge is real, and what we really wanted to focus on in our 2014 research is to better understand how we could introduce science and technical information, especially on a controversial issue, about what's going on in ag and food, so that they're actually considering the value of these things when they're making decisions. We also wanted to understand the communication channels that moms, millennials, and foodies, as well as those early adopters, use when they're forming their opinions and attitudes about the issues within the industry. So when we come into research, we always like to look back, look at the other research that others have available, as well as utilize what we know. The trust model was developed by CFI back in 2007 when we formed, and we put this through our research process, and this is a peer-reviewed and published model on how you build trust in food. Ultimately, at the end of the day, I think those in the industry will understand that the ultimate value is to have freedom to operate, to do what it is that you want to do, that gives you a marketplace, global access to the market that will get your product out there and keep it there. To be able to have freedom to operate, you have to maintain your social license. Social license is your ability, it's minimal formalized regulations that allow you to do what's right. So you're following the law, but you have some ability to navigate what's right for your consumer base. To be able to maintain that social license, then you have to have trust. So when we did this research, we worked with Steve Sapp at Iowa State, and we did a meta-analysis of 21 different pieces of research that exist on how you build trust. And there are 3 components on how you do that. The first is influential others. So this is your friends and your family, as well as the credentialed people in your life that help inform you. So this could be your doctor, your dietitian, your mechanic. Pick the topic and find the person that's influential there, as well as those friends and family. Competence. We've been talking a lot about this today. It's the technical skills and capabilities you bring to a job. It's your facts and your science. The third piece is confidence, and this really has to do with a value similarity. So are you a person like me? Do you believe what I believe? Are we on the same wavelength for these different issues, social issues especially? And what our research showed was that shared values, or that confidence piece, was 3 to 5 times more important than facts or competence in building trust. If I flip that on its head, it means facts are 3 to 5 times less important than values when you're trying to build trust. We came with that finding in the first year, and we went, no way. Some data got changed, some table got flipped, because we know facts always are going to outweigh our ability to impact trust. We tested it our second year, and the results were even stronger. So then, it's basic relationship building, right? You don't go to your blind date and have dinner and expect to come away with a marriage proposal, or at least you shouldn't. And I think that's how we've solved problems in the past, right? There's a challenge. Here's we do the research, we bring you the fact, it's done. But what we know now with the way that consumers expect to have rationale and expect a different way of approaching this, we have to apply a different level of communications to build their trust. So we went, we're going to have a hard time bringing this to an industry that's always used facts to verify what we're doing. And so we wanted to have a definition of sustainability, and our definition is three-pronged, with the base of it being focused on ethics. We've got to showcase that there's values in this industry that drive everything that we do. We're people, after all. So really grounding in ethics. The second one, we cannot not do away with our science. We have to have it. It's what verifies that what we say is right in ethics is actually doable. The third piece is economics. I mean, if we don't make a profit, we don't have a business, right? So we have to have the ability to have profitability. When you think about back to that scale, the top two really serve to increase knowledge and provide facts and showcase a level of competence. But when we think about these social issues, these aren't questions about competence. They're questions about ethics. So as you look at the issue on the right, what's in the food you're buying? BPA, artificial coloring, potassium bromate, olestra. Those are questions that we could provide an answer about what those chemicals are, or additives are, what role they play, et cetera. But that's not what the consumer's asking. They're asking, should you be putting this in our food anyway? And what's the risk that I'm assuming by you making that decision? So while we can answer the can question all day, the real question that's being asked is the should question. And that should question comes at the base of the triangle. That's where feelings and perceptions and beliefs are actually impacted. And then you can start to have those science-based questions, or discussions at the top of the triangle once you've established that your ethics are in alignment. Okay? Again, this year's research focused on moms, millennials, foodies. We had 2005 consumers. This was a representative sampling of the US population. You can see the splits. 30% were mom, 37% were millennials, and 21% were foodies, and there was some crossover. So you could have had a foodie that was a mom, et cetera. We asked people about life issues because we want to know how do food issues compare to overall kind of life event issues. And we have 18 different issues that we ask about. And as you can see, these were the ones that rated tops. We asked them to rate their level of concern on a scale of 0 to 10 about all of these different issues. 72% of all respondents said that rising healthcare costs were a top box concern. So they rated them an 8, a 9, a 10. Rising cost of food was equal at 72%. Then you jump down to 69 and 70, US economy, as well as keeping healthy food affordable, down to rising energy costs. All of these input have some sort of direct impact on me, right? They hit me because it's a safety issue or it's an economic issue or a health issue in some sort of fashion. The other food system concerns that we asked about are all listed here, and the percentages you see are the percentage of our respondents that gave it a top box or a high level of concern. What you can see, one that I'll show out here, or two, I guess, imported food safety versus food safety in general, slightly higher if we're talking imported food. Then the other one that I really want to focus on is having enough food to feed people outside of the US. I haven't heard that mentioned here today, but within all of the other food groups, that's a very consistent message. We have to produce more using less. We want to feed people outside the US, and that is not a concern consistently not a concern for the vast majority of the consumers here. Also, I pointed this out, but every issue we asked about, women were more concerned than men, and early adopters were the same. They had a higher level of concern across all issues than the later adopters on that adoption and diffusion curve. As we think about those different segments, keeping healthy food affordable is a real concern for folks. We had 70% of respondents, 69% of respondents that said keeping healthy food affordable is something they're highly concerned about. And you can see that's in the top 9.27. These are mean scores across all the moms, foodies, and millennials here. It's a very high level of concern. You also see food safety rising through, and then the rising cost of food is something that resonates there as well. So where do consumers go for information? This was the first time in our 8 years of doing this study that websites rose to the top as the first source of information they go to be informed about food. We also asked about Google specifically because we thought websites is pretty specific, but they wouldn't necessarily consider a search engine that. And if you combine the top two, you've got 30% of the population that goes first, either to a website or to Google. This is important for us to understand because I think most people are online, but are you online meaningfully, and are you optimizing sites, and are you communicating in a way that's going to actually reach people? So definitely pay attention to that. It's that first time we've seen that. Every year prior, local TV station has been the first source that the biggest bulk of people have gone to for food system related information. As we think about the other segments too, the results are even stronger for that online presence. So websites ranked highest for everyone, but if you add in the Google there, you have no less than 33% of the population, of that group's population, as well as all the way up to 41% for our early adopters. And then when we think about specific sources, we split this out a couple different ways this year. One was just, let me get this off here so I can set it up. One was just, we just want your general understanding about who you would go to as a source, or who you would consider trustworthy as a source on GMOs. So I'll show you the breakouts of, on the left side, the blue is a low level of trust, and the green in the middle is kind of mushy middle. People they're kind of undecided. And on the on the right, it's a high level of trust on those gray bars. So it was a list of 11 different sources of information that we gave them. We didn't assign a picture. We didn't say this is what this person says. We just said, who do you trust, or what's your level of trust in this person on that same 0 to 10 scale. So university scientists, you can see that the mean score, none of the mean scores got into that even high level of trust area. But you can see that a pretty significant amount of people put trust in university scientists, a scientist who's a mom, and a farmer on this one for GMOs in that top box. You've got a lot of opportunity, and I think this is what we really need to focus on any of these slides I'll show you, because that is the rational majority of people who just don't have enough information to decide. If we can utilize getting messages to early adopters who, again, are science-seeking, they like multiple sources of information, they form their opinion and then they share it out. If we can utilize that group of people to then share their information with those folks that are in the middle and haven't made up their mind, then I think we can get a lot more of that middle population to come to the right. A peer who shares my interests about food, that ranked pretty high. And when you think about trusting friends or trusting peers, peers for the general consumer are as important as peer-reviewed for the science and technical industry. So think about that. And as it relates to some of the subsets, for example, foodies rate the opinions of their peers much higher than the general population. And I believe that's because they really understand and that their peers are as passionate as they are and are as educated on the subject of food as they are. So they're going to apply that to them. They're going to give them that offering. State government scientist, just under a third of the population has a high level of trust. Federal government scientist, 32. An advocacy group, someone who's a mom, a well-known food blogger. These are all in those 20s. And then Dr. Oz. Where's the applause? And a celebrity chef. And I'll point you to the mean score. We wanted specifically to ask about him. There are a lot of groups that study, they might say a television show or a celebrity. Celebrity chef, we ask about that, a celebrity doctor. And I think Dr. Oz is such an influencer. I was really adamant about putting his name in particular because of a couple things. One, in my doctor's office, there is a sign that published I think it was a European study that said, 50% of what is on his show is not based in science. So that was one that I said, this is a trigger. He's getting questions, and he said, you don't know how many times people come in and say, Dr. Oz said, and then they have an ailment or a prescription they need or something. So that was That was one, but also we hear it all the time through our consumer interactions. We see it in the media that he's he's influential enough that he's helping people think about different things. And although he is not what people would say has a high level of trust as a source of information, at least on this topic, I will caution us to get too excited about that mean score, because he might not be their first source of information, but he does have a level of exposure and reach and frequency that people are hearing him. And when he does talk about any topic, it does get broader penetration than we're able to, probably if every one of us in this room went and talked to everybody we knew. So get excited, but not too excited about that one. I also wanted to show you, if you're interested, I can provide the breakouts here too. But the one thing that I wanted to highlight here is, as you look across total population, moms' perceptions of those different sources, and then foodies have a higher level of trust in all sources than other groups. And again, we think that's because they really feel they have a better understanding of what's going in the industry. They know what they want, and so they've chosen those that they really like. This year's research, again, I said we pulled together different models from anthropology, psychology, and sociology to try to find a spot where we can have real great insights for how you get people to consider those different elements on technical issues and highly controversial issues. I won't be able to go through all of it, but what I want you to come away with were what were some of the key message elements we need to think about when we talk about the challenges that we have today, and who are the different sources we should put in a position to be talking about these things. So what we did is we developed some scenarios, and we put together fundamental message elements. These are things that you need to consider, that you need to address in all of the messaging that you would put out there, in all of the communications that you'd have. We also considered several outrage factors. Outrage factors are the things that we discovered in our 2013 study when we looked into transparency. Things like just completely ignoring what's right for society. Things like having an at-risk population and ignoring their needs. So things that really put people over the edge on a particular issue in a crisis situation. We wrote the scenarios in 3 different voices to trust, to be able to test the level of trust that different messengers have. Scenarios were exactly the same, and we split our groups so that they weren't seeing anything twice. But what we wanted to do was put in 3 messengers who would represent the different sides of our trust model, so the competence and the confidence. So the mom scientist was supposed to give that, kind of resonate with the confidence that it's somebody that has a lot of values, that's going to be concerned about what's going on in food, plus the competency side. Government scientists, just competence, and peer, just confidence. I'm showing imagery here, but we did not present any level, we didn't give images in the research. So it was just words on a page, and it was this source of information is delivering this. Quickly on the way that we measured or came to our conclusion about how you can trust a messenger or not was this model. So we started with believability of those individual message elements. We tested then the overall message believability when you pull them together, and we put that along with the competence of that source of information, that messenger. We also looked at whether the message elements promote comfort. This has to do with that confidence piece. Whether putting all of those together increases promotes the level of comfort. How much confidence they have in the messenger, and then the R scores came through and gave us messenger trust. So our approach here, again, we chose 2 different topics, antibiotic resistance and GM foods. I'll just focus on GMOs for this one. We asked them to rate their level of trust of those 3 different voices, and we gave them before and after scenarios. So we said, on the topic of GMOs, do you trust a mom scientist, a government scientist, or a peer who shares your interest most? Then we introduced the information. We gave them a statement that that messenger said. And what we did was incorporated a lot of the values-based messaging that we talk about. So that reinforced, I'm a person like you, I care, here's the science that supports the ethics that I have in this position. Our intent with this research was not to come away with a bucket of messages that anybody could use as a plug and play to solve problems. Our goal was to try to come away with what are the message elements that are important to consumers to consider as you're developing your messaging. So first of all, which messengers were most trusted? Overall, before we started, we did that pre-piece and just said, who would you trust? Mom scientists showed the highest average trust scores for all, when compared to any of those messengers. After, they were still the highest, but their mean scores had dropped. We think that's because when you introduce a highly controversial issue and put it in the voice of somebody that was previously trusted, people trust a little bit less. She still has the values connection, but it's not as strong as when previously put before the controversy was introduced. For the government scientists, they actually showed the lowest average trust score among those three messengers, but after, they were higher, and they were second in both, second to the mom scientist. The peer had the second highest average score among all those three, and after, the peer was lowest in both. And what this shows us is that if you can talk at that values level, if you can show that you have a level of confidence that's similar to the person that you're connecting with, then and reinforced through science, then there's something more there, and then trust exists. Let's see here. For moms, I'll go through these kind of quickly. Moms were the same. So the moms in our survey respondents trusted mom scientists first, before, and after. For early adopters, mom scientists first, followed by peers, and then government scientists, and we saw a flip there, where mom scientists was both, trusted both, and then government scientists were second on both. So the peers and the government scientists flopped. Oops. So that's positive. And oftentimes people say, well, why didn't you say like a company scientist or something like that? The reason that we didn't is because we've already confirmed through prior research that the closer you're connected to profit, the less credibility you have. So I'm going to go through the message elements that we found were most important for you to be thinking about as you develop messages about controversial or just highly complex topics. I'll talk to you about what each one of them means, and then I'll propose one, a type of statement that could be used by any of the groups in the room. So accurate presentation of risks. Consumers always want you to admit the good, the bad, the ugly, right? They want you to be forthcoming, not just honest, but forthcoming with the fact that risks exist, especially in food. I mean, it's a risk to put anything in your mouth, right? So they want to, I guess, have a feeling that you are acknowledging that risks do exist. Secondly, transparency. We firmly believe transparency is the next sustainability as it relates to food dialogue and companies in general. Being open and transparent has to do with acknowledging both sides of the story, or more in some cases. Providing a level of depth so that it doesn't appear that you're holding information back, and then avoiding oversimplification. I mentioned earlier, don't assume that you're dumbing things down. Don't try to make things so simple, because consumers really get offended when they think you're trying to make things too simple for them. So really focus on making it relevant to the situation they're in, but don't miss out on details that are important to tell the story simply because you're trying to simplify. And the last one here, unifying message. This has to do with that values connection, some compelling single message that really touches that ethical side, or a deeper driver of human behavior. Something, I like to think about this in terms of something that nobody can disagree with, right? We all want safe food, right? We're all in this business to make a difference. Those different types of things are going to be important. So here are some examples that may or may not be where you would be, but some things that I came away with. So accurate presentation of risks. Just as there are risks to getting into a car, a bus, or even walking on the sidewalk every day, there are risks to most everything we do. When you think about food, it'd be false to say that there aren't risks in consuming it that have chemical compounds. It's also false to say that chemical compounds in food present a risk. And then you can have the conversation from there. So being able to set the framework and put it in a language for something that they already start to agree with where you're coming from, and showcase the fact that the risk is inherent in everything we do, right? I think affirming or going forward on this, so give them an example of why this would be important to them. So let's take sodium chloride. It's a chemical found in nearly every food, also known as salt, right? It has positive things. It brings out great flavors. It supports thyroid function. It helps balance pH level. It can be deadly if it's consumed at levels too high for our bodies to regulate. So as we work as toxicologists, we've found that it's ideal. We have to focus on ideal levels to balance our consumption of salt based on that information. Okay, so talk about what you know, and then frame it so that you can talk about what consumers don't know but are concerned about. And the assumption is that we always will always present the truth, right? We're not just going to say something just to smooth over. Openness and transparency. So as a scientist, researcher, regulator, insert your title here. I seek opportunities to share my latest findings. I also want to know what questions the research raises. That's my job. It's our job to ensure that what we're researching is actually relevant to the public's needs, and that's when we share it, when it's actually usable. At the end of the day, this is this unifying message. One, you try to get something that people are always going to agree with. At the end of the day, I'm a mom, dad, grandparent, whatever's true for you. There's nothing more important to me than keeping my kids safe. It's my job as a parent. It's my passion as a scientist to focus on this safety side of things. What I know about chemical compounds or ingredients or whatever it is you're being asked about that are hard to pronounce that doesn't mean they present a greater level of risk. And I threw that one in there just simply because we see so much of that. We manage a consumer website, and that's one of the things we get all the time. It's the ingredient you can't pronounce, it's a chemical with a scary sounding name, etc. The other elements that are important to consider when messaging have to do with these outrage factors. And the couple that came to the top that were most important were a sufficient level of control. So folks wanted to know that government agencies address risks competently, that there's actual oversight, and that when rules aren't followed, that they actually follow through and correct the situation. The second one has to do with process, and this is about stakeholder engagement. Is this organization or company, agency, are they listening? Are they getting my opinion? Are they providing complete and understandable information? Is it readily available? Can I go to a website and get it? This is really about engaging people, and people want to be heard. They understand that their opinions don't need to be the outcome, don't need to, reflect that outcome every single time, but they at least want a sounding board, if you will. So really think about involving people in these discussions. So to come away with a message there, government agencies like EPA, FDA, whomever, have an important hands-on role in analyzing research, ensuring proper methodology, and verifying reproducible results across multiple studies so that we know that the results are real and widely applicable. And you have to talk about what's true for you and what it is that you're doing or the situation that exists, but really addressing that in a way that helps them understand how this is important to them. And then process. It's important to get input from multiple perspectives to ensure we're learning what concerns exist, what factors we've not considered, and ultimately how we can create the safest products possible. Okay. So I'll give you I wanted to tie a big red bow on everything and say, where do we go from here? Those are some examples of the way I think we can approach this, but I think we need to understand, you have a lot of data that exists on the topics that we were talking about today, and you have very little data on some of the potential chemicals that need to be addressed and that are going to come out. So just general recommendations as you think about communicating that. One, just remember that believability is a key driver in creating trust. So those message elements that I talked about, really considering the different drivers of trust are going to help you people believe the story that's being told, but also help ultimately build trust for what's going on in the industry. As you think about chemical compounds, just some questions to ask as you think about getting those messages together. What is your objective in talking about this with the public? Is it to get the issue off of the media, or is it to embrace that dialogue, to really have a broader discussion about it? What simply do you want to communicate, or do you have to communicate? Sometimes you'll have very little information, and sometimes you'll have too much. So you have to determine what is it that's important to communicate. What do your stakeholders expect from you on this issue? And I said not just your first stakeholder, to reinforce what I actually said earlier about don't just think about the first person or the only person that's asking the question. Think about everybody who could be a recipient of that product or could eventually ask the question. And then what are your key message elements? And again, just a reinforcement that those are the ones that were most important for believability. Next, really focus on the groups that you want to engage. And one of the questions that Monsi and Allison had asked was, who should we engage? Who should be the first people we go to on this? And I think for different chemicals, it's going to probably matter. But if it's foodies, for example, it might be, think about what values and concerns they bring forward. Think about the sources that are credible to them. Listen to them and understand the values before you try to develop the strategy. How do you know who to engage on the subjects we're talking about today? Focus on the people who are really interested in asking questions. If people are interested, if they're asking questions and willing to ask the hard questions, you've got the opportunity to interact in a different way than maybe we have been before. But also thinking about the different audiences that are really important to the industry. I mean, you've got to think about regulators. You probably have to think about media. You have to think about maybe consumer groups or the at-risk populations that are going to be on the receiving end of some of the information that might be more sensitive for them. So I think the answer is it depends, but as you think about what the results are going to show or not, you've got to think about who's paying attention today and how can we most immediately address their concerns, and then how does that bridge to an overarching strategy. Once you've identified that, go to where they are. Don't expect they're always going to come to you, because we know those communication channels that used to be expert, send out. That doesn't exist today in the same way it used to. Well, while you might have that to a couple channels, you've got to assume that you have to be a resource for people. So you have to go to those communities. We have a system that we utilize called Signals. It's a proprietary system we developed to watch different issues in media, both traditional media and online channels, to understand what issues are being talked about at what time, to be able to anticipate and get in front of those issues. When you go into the communities, speak the language that exists for those tribes, quote unquote, you have to choose messengers or sources or experts that are going to align with the values of the people you're trying to connect with. So if you're going to regulators, there's going to be a different level of value connection there. You can probably focus on the president of the company and the key leaders within the company. But if you're going out to maybe you're getting a petition or a really focused effort from a mom's group, or maybe an activist group that has a high population of elderly or something, you've got to find a spokesperson that aligns with the values of that group. So really think about how you can allow the messenger to be themselves for that group. Once you've done that, you really have to come into those conversations with a values-based engagement strategy. We heard it here earlier, the science, the general public does not have a good understanding of the scientific process. There's just not a scientific literacy that exists within our society, period. So we can't, though, have our first goal going into these communities to be to educate, which is a really hard reality to swallow. Our first goal has to be to come into these communities and embrace the skepticism that exists, maybe the fear, maybe the misunderstanding, and utilize a process to get on the same page with people. Because if we don't embrace that skepticism, we're really going to miss the opportunity to get that values-based communication. Because what people are saying is, I'm struggling here, I don't trust what's going on, I need some help. And if you've got the opportunity to kind of triage that situation, you're going to have a much better level of success. We actually have a communications training program that teaches and reinforces that approach. It's just 3 steps. The first one is the hardest, and that's to listen without judgment. That's the embracing the skepticism. So I'm assuming that a lot of the conversations you're on the receiving end of a lot of comments that are vastly uninformed, maybe even they're very hard to be on the receiving end of, because they might be so wrong or so insulting. So listen without judgment is that first piece, to just try to understand what values do they have that are coming through in that question or statement. And then the second piece is ask questions to inform the dialogue and to clarify their perspective. Ask questions probably 3 and 4 times to make sure you are understanding what's driving that concern for them. And then 3 is where you finally get to share your perspective. You get to reinforce that you share their values, and here's what you know about that. And so there's a whole program on that. People always say, yeah, but what if you can't? What if you can't? You know, just butting heads, there's no way you can agree. You have that opportunity to walk away. And the biggest question we have there is there an ethical misalignment between your values and theirs? Are they questioning your ethical right to allow any chemical in an ingredient or in a food product ever? If they are, there's probably not an opportunity to agree or move past those first couple steps. So you always have the opportunity to agree to walk away. And the last, I guess, piece of recommendation then is commit to engaging over time, because while I think a lot of these questions, you know, in the old communications cycles and the way that people accepted information, it might have been a one and done sort of interaction. But now, trust building is not an event. It's a process that you have to be invested in over time. And continued engagement and authentic transparency, really being committed and being in a partnership with consumers, with the agencies, with everybody you're trying to connect with, is really going to help build that informed decision making over time. But we're not going to get there either without practice. So make sure that as you're building strategic communications plans and that sort of thing, they're actually practiced and dusted off before you come into the position where it's something on fire. So I think that's it. A couple of resources, foodintegrity.org. I mentioned our research summary. You can go there and get that, or email, get my information and email me and I'll get you a copy. The other one is bestfoodfacts.org. That's our consumer website where consumers come, ask questions. We pair them with university experts to answer those questions about food, everything from the silly to the sciencey. With that, any questions?
So thank you for your presentation. Couple of things. I actually, coming away from this, feel more encouraged that the approach by trying to pull together a framework to address this we need to communicate that this process is beginning.
Yes.
And therefore, we're not exactly sure how it's going to shake out, but we're working at this. And so 2 things from your talk this afternoon. One, at this stage, ingredients and what's added to food is most top of mind for consumers. The conversation around process form compounds, not so much. Yes, they've heard about acrylamide, but in my mind, you know, it's a different process. Today we heard about this. This is cooking, so it's kind of a natural. So that's beneficial for us on our side in trying to manage this risk communications. And then your slide where you showed the shared values and the facts and the trust, and that shared values was really far more important, is back again, bringing back to the framework that we can be very transparent in the information we don't have, but yet we've got to figure out how to manage this, and that in fact there are 800 or 900 compounds potentially, rather than just one individually. And I think during the break I was talking, Charlie Santier was saying, you know, it's kind of this drip drip is not so effective, but if you put it into context that there's so many. So I'd just like you to comment a little bit to bring it back to specific to the dialogue today.
Sure.
Your reaction as you think about what you just said and yet what we've talked about today.
And I think a couple things. One, helping people understand that chemicals, whether they're process found chemicals or they're naturally occurring chemicals, we're all a whole bunch of chemicals bunched together. Just taking it back to simple science helps them understand, oh, it would be silly for me to make a demand that all chemicals be taken out of food. Most people aren't thinking about, you know, science 101. That's one piece of it. Yes, I think there's a little bit more of a gimme when it has to do with process, because that's or process formed compounds, because I think that's more perceived as more natural. I did have some, I didn't have them in today's, but we do have some data on perceptions or behavioral attributes of people who have these strong opinions about food, and over again. If something is perceived as more natural, it has a halo effect. If something is perceived as having fewer chemicals, especially added chemicals, it has a halo effect. I think what most people will be very understanding about is, you can't change one thing without expecting change in some other way. I think most people will understand that, and getting some very basic examples together. If you change a chain, or if you put a different size chain on a bike, it's going to change the performance of the bike in a different way. Find some examples, some really good examples that would represent the interests or the passions of people that you're trying to connect with. So I definitely think that's it. And then, like I said, be willing to talk about what we know, but also what we don't know, but that we're so focused on the end goal, which is keeping food safe, period. I mean, those are places. And then understanding and having a good, solid deck of meaningful, of relevant information on the chemicals that you think are of most concern to folks. Acrylamide, that one will probably continue to be in discussions. It'll be interesting to see the potato, the GMO potato. Obviously, there's enough controversy just because of GMO, but that is a real health benefit, right, or risk reduction. Not necessarily sure how much of a significant reduction it is. I've heard some different perceptions there, but in any case, that could be a perceived benefit to consumers. And I think always focusing, especially on these controversial subjects, on how risk can be managed, but also how the benefits are in their favor for those types of things.
Roxi, thank you so much. It was a really great way to share with a bunch of scientists the real importance of communication. One of the things that we've seen today is sort of discussion about what's the role of risk assessment versus risk management, and where's that overlap. I think your presentation makes it clear that we need to involve the third party as well, the risk communication. And you can't just say if you're a risk assessor, you'll pass it on to the risk communicator. Everybody's got to wear different hats sometimes. So I really appreciate the messages that you provided. Certainly, we can't get anyone's attention unless they perceive us to have some shared values, and to personalize ourselves first, to demonstrate that we are actually human beings, and to get away from some of the not so flattering scientific stereotypes is really great. So I appreciate you making that point so well. I do want to take exception to one of the suggestions that you've made. I'm interested in,
Sure.
in your views on that. One of the things you said earlier today, and then in your later comments, was try to tell people about, here's all these common risks, to put the food risk in perspective. So the risk about, driving your car and walking on the sidewalk and that sort of thing. And I know Vince Covello did a lot of work on that, showing risk comparisons in many cases. And really, Vince argued vociferously that you've got to be very, very careful when you're comparing unrelated risks. I know in your example here, you had a nice way to pivot back to the issue of foods and to talk about both uncertainties and things. But I think as scientists, I've seen so many times at meetings where people have just, taken what seems to be very logical scientifically. Well, your risk of getting hit by lightning is greater than this, so what are you worried about? That sort of thing. Mm-hmm. Well, the bottom line is people are worried about it. Yep. And I know Covello in his work has talked about different levels of risk comparisons to make it a little bit easier to try to choose the closest one that you possibly can. But I just want to, say, we need to be a little bit careful. Some of those outrage factors that you talked about,
yes.
The controllability, the equity, the risk-benefit, who's taking the risk, who's getting the benefit, those are very important, as well as, something like driving in a car. You talk about, that, but, we all know people who've died in car accidents, so it may not be necessarily helping our case to say, see, everything's fine with these chemicals that you fear. So I just want to throw it out to you to get your thoughts on that.
You're absolutely right. Thanks, Dr. Carl. Absolutely, you have to find connected risk. I think that's really important. And you don't ever get to have any of those conversations or deliver any of those messages until you've connected the values level. That's what I didn't say first. So really, you don't ever get to be in a conversation with the technical stuff until you've confirmed that you connect with the person, which is really hard, especially when you think about maybe media or just report out. But what Dr. Carl said just now was, you're actually real people. You know, in front of all that alphabet soup of letters behind your name that are really important, and as I said, give you such a distinguished credential with anybody that you should sit with. They really just want to know that there's a heart in there. Roosevelt said it best, right? People don't care what you know until they know you care. That's one of those things that you've got to get that connection. So absolutely. And I think if you can, on the risk side of things, I think that my main point is really focused on the risks are fewer than, or less than it might seem as it's being presented in the media, and never ever, your point is well taken, never ever just try to say, well, you're analyzing that all wrong, your risk isn't worthy of my consideration, because for people, even though their perception isn't accurate, it is their reality. And so trying to bypass the fear or the reality that exists related to that question or related to that comment is a huge no-no. So always bridging. We have a whole, we call it blocking and bridging. It's a media technique that we've adapted for online and in-person conversations, but saying, you know, I totally understand where you're coming from. As a mom, there's nothing more important. Or it's really interesting that you could say that. I don't know much on that. What I can tell you about what I know is this. So always bridging and not ever stepping out of the bounds of what we know and don't know, but always addressing the values connection, that your fears are founded because there's so much information, or the concern that you bring forward is an important one to talk about. You don't ever want to repeat negative language either. Yeah, I can understand why you'd be scared about that. Let's maybe not go there. Let's talk about the fact there's a lot of misinformation out there, or there's a lot of information that people are reading. What do you read? You know, collect a little information through that Q&A process to inform yourself of where they're coming from or what they've read. So thank you. And thank you to Dr. Carl. He's one of our experts for Best Food Facts. And he'll actually be with us in about a month. We're doing a blogger tour to help introduce to them science and technology and food, and how that relates to what they consume every day. So we'll be out in California at Davis for a portion of the tour, so he'll be with us. So thank you.
Roxy, thank you very much for your presentation, and Allison, thank you and your team and the Food Chemical Safety for putting this workshop together. I want to kind of go back to April of 2002, and I want to ask the attendees in the room today, where were you when April 2002 came up? Where were you when we first identified acrylamide in food? Were you in your office that you're at today? Were you with another organization or another group? And I only say that because I think we need to go back to the past to identify the roadmap for communicating in the future. Right after we first identified acrylamide in food, and the paper was published, I believe, in April of that year, actually Jeff Sand, the Joint Institute for Food Safety and Applied Nutrition, put on a workshop along with the National Center for Toxicological Research. And part of that workshop, I believe, was a risk communication roundtable. And we were quite fortunate to be part of that roundtable. And I think some of the things that we heard today are still evident and very similar to how we communicate about these issues in the context of the media then and in the media now, maybe slightly different. From that workshop, there came about recommendations to develop an information clearinghouse, an expert network, media outreach, and consumer research. Following up on that, IFIC conducted consumer research, and we found at that time back in 2003 that most consumers were not aware of acrylamide, and for the most part they did not or were not likely to change their diet. I wanted to come back, fast forward to 2011 and 12, and just say that we actually conducted another research project where we used acrylamide as an example, and very similar things that we found then were still similar today. Consumers are not aware of acrylamide. They're not likely to change their diet based on acrylamide. They're more interested in changing their diet over things like fat, sugar, or sodium before acrylamide. So I only kind of use that as an opportunity for us to think through what else are consumers really concerned about, and how do we balance either a proactive communication strategy versus a reactive?
Yep.
When is the time to be proactive versus when is the time to help respond to questions that might appear? And just one other piece I kind of throw out there, taking a look today at the social media space, we actually did an anthropological research looking at a number of what we termed in our food safety committee high priority chemicals, and acrylamide was one of them. Over a 1 year period, there were approximately 275 posts, original posts about acrylamide. That's in the social media space. It's minute compared to all the other conversations that are taking place. And one of your comments actually mentioned, take the conversation where it's being held. What we learned from our research was that the people who are talking about these issues are not likely ones that they're gonna change their perception, their belief, or behavior. So I just kind of throw that out just as, again, we've done and have collected with a lot of the individuals that are here today, really developed that roadmap for communications. How can we take what we've had, given the limited resources we have, and really use that to leverage what we might want to do in the future?
Yep.
Just a few thoughts.
Thanks,
Thank
Tony. Definitely, a couple things that are important. Proportional response is what we call that. Don't create an issue where there's not an issue. I'm not saying a report comes out and you go, okay, everybody, okay, world, here's what we know, here's what we don't know, here's every scary sounding chemical you've never heard, and here's why you need to be concerned because we're going to attach the word risk in the article. Absolutely not. You need to understand, that's why we say, excuse me, our monitoring system. Let's understand the landscape of where the conversations are being had, and importantly, at what volume. So we use our signals and our site system to help inform us of where those conversations are, how frequently they're happening, at the level, the volume at which they're happening, and who's talking. And then to reinforce your second point, absolutely. When we do our communications trainings, I start out with a goals slide. Our first goal can never be to educate, and that hurts some feelings, but it's the reality of where we have to be. Our goal can never, ever be to change the minds of activists, and that's, to your second point. They've already made up their mind. They're the innovators on the option of innovation curve. They're set, they're going, they're not asking questions or permission. And in fact, they don't really want people in their business. So with the activist crowd, you're not going to get them or you don't want them. Because if you get them, they're going to have more demands. So I think that's a very important point as well to consider. This isn't about going to the masses with something they're not asking for. It's about addressing concerns. And from a regulatory standpoint, we do nothing on the policy side. So I'm maybe stepping a little bit out of bounds there. But you have to understand what potential implications these could mean for you and be able story shaped before you would go out to those groups. So, thanks, Tony.
That my fault? I don't understand. Nobody has really said. I talked with Alan at lunchtime, but nobody has really said that. Understand why people have cooked food for 1 million years for reasons. Okay, the reasons are other risks. Microbial risks, and preservation of food. One might look at these as benefits, but no, this is a risk risk-risk comparison. And so, shouldn't this be a part of the risk communication that we do these things, and these things that protect us from microbes produce other things that we have to that are there.
Yeah.
And we can't avoid some of that. And I mean, why isn't this part of the message?
I think part of it is it's a for granted thing. I think it's worthy of bringing up. I think it's a nice reminder to say to people, remember when we first started and nobody cooked anything and then we discovered fire. Now look at what that did, and now look at our culinary offerings, and now look at the benefits we get, and look at we can avoid bacteria, we can avoid listeria, we can avoid different contaminants, E. coli, salmonella. The challenge is, I'm probably not stating all of that correctly, so I shouldn't state that, but there are definitely things that go away when you heat food, correct? There are definite benefits, but I think that takes a reminder. You have to be in a conversation long enough to get to a point where that's a valid thing to bring in, because right now, just as people are not going to ever safety is a non-negotiable, it's also a situation where people aren't thinking about how it used to be. They're looking at the lens
It's
of
not
today's
used to be how it
reality.
is now. We
Right, so-
process food to make it safe from microbial risk.
But that's not something, what I'm saying is it's I think an assumption that the industry has made for how consumers understand the food that's coming to them. I think consumers don't understand that there's any benefit to that processing that happens. I think they hear rumors about process is bad. I mean, there's a reason that we have the, no processed 50-day diet and the eating clean diet and those types of things, because there isn't an assumed or an understood benefit to the processing that's gone into food. When you ask people, fresh or frozen, what has more nutrition, the vast majority of people will say, well, of course, fresh. And then you ask the experts and they go, no, flash freezing at the point of highest nutrition, at the peak of ripeness.
No, we're talking about a risk comparisons here. Okay, we're not talking about, if we want to talk about the flavor of food and everything, we can do that too, but no, the industry processes food so that it preserves it, which is the story of mankind,
Yeah.
by the way, and also it keeps us from getting sick or dying, immediately
And
or the next day. And so why isn't this a part of the equation?
I understand that. I believe that. I think most consumers would, but it's not a conversation that's happening today. It's just not it's not a benefit that's perceived. It seems more, and here's a great example: vaccinations. Okay, if you look at what has happened with vaccinations over time, there is a greater perceived risk among populations of people for getting a vaccination than there is a perceived benefit. And the reason that is, that the researchers have looked at, is that let's say polio, for example. They look around, nobody has polio. Okay, so am I going to put an active agent in my body that's going to potentially infect me or maybe cause my kid autism? They're going to look at what they've heard, and they're going to look at the environment and go, this seems to be more risky. And I think that's the situation that consumers are in when somebody goes, oh, processed food's bad.
But
And the industry hasn't told.
Some of us would think that that's not a correct situation that we ought to correct. Okay, the idea of rejecting vaccination, we know that story.
Right, absolutely.
That's a.
I'm just trying to.
That's not that's not a victory statement. Okay, this is a bad situation.
Absolutely.
And if you're saying this is similar, then we need to correct it then.
Yeah, absolutely. There needs to be more communication about all the things that have gone into today's food supply to protect people. It's not a story that's been told. And I think, as I talked about earlier, there are a lot of things in today's food system that consumers go, oh, well, that's different than when I was growing up. But they don't understand that there's a benefit to them. They understand, oh, it economically benefits that big bad company, but they don't assess that there's any sort of benefit to them.
Why can't we tell them that?
We should. I think we agree.
This is simple compared to talking about different chemicals or this and that. The point is that the processing preserves the food so you can eat it, next month.
Yep.
And it also keeps you from getting sick.
As long as.
This is a risk thing that we're doing. Why don't we explain this to people?
Yep. Absolutely.
And it's easy to explain.
We do.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think Roxy, I think you've done a great job of kind of demonstrating that. So yeah, I want to give her a hand.